Good afternoon and welcome to the third session of our International Student-Focused Political Webinar Series hosted by International Student and Scholar Services. My name is Chelsea Wells and I am the Director of ISSS. The purpose of the webinar series is to provide international students and other students who are not US citizens with a foundational context for discussions around the US presidential election, and also to provide resources to you about your rights and responsibilities, as well as information about how to get involved so that your voices are heard. You can find out more information about our political webinar series this month, as well as our upcoming session by going to the ISSS website at isss.utah.edu. If you're interested in attending our last session next week, please do not forget to register for the event through our website. If you were not able to attend our previous sessions on the US political system and international student rights and responsibilities, recordings of those sessions have been posted on our website for your reference. We will also be adding links to additional information and other resources about each topic, so please remember to check this page for further updates. Our session today is focused on understanding US media and consumerism. For the few of you who did fill out our poll at the beginning here, thank you for sharing your opinion there. And it does look like for the poll respondees that most people do use official news sources, so that's good. And it provides some context for our panelists today as they answer your questions. Throughout the discussion today, we hope to provide information about the journalistic process, so how a journalist identifies topics, finds content, and writes a story. Also, what is fake news and how to recognize it? What to watch for when consuming US media content, particularly with the advent of different platforms of information sharing, including social media and YouTube. And then finally, how to research various topics in order to best find the facts. As you can see, our topics today address various aspects of the news and consumerism cycle, from how news stories are created, to recognizing fake news, the consumerist experience, and how to engage knowledgeably with the various sources of information, and then finally, how to research information and ensure that what you're reading is factual. The last 15 minutes or so of our session today will be devoted to a question and answer session specifically with our panelists. I'm excited to welcome our distinguished panelists for today's session. Our panelists include Taylor Stevens, State Government Reporter, Salt Lake Tribune, Randy Dreyer, Presidential Honors Professor, Professor Lecturer, and Avery Holton was unfortunately not able to join us today, so he will not be part of our panel, but maybe if he can join us a little bit later on, we'll bring him into the discussion. And then our last panelist is Darby Fanning. She's an associate librarian at the Marriott Library. We sincerely thank all of our panelists for joining us today and providing their expertise and insight into these topics. If you experience any technical difficulties during this webinar session, please email the ISSS Tech inbox and we will assist you as best we can. The email address will be posted in the chat for your reference. If you have any questions for our panelists during today's session, please submit your questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. There's a button you can click right on that Q&A. We kindly ask that you do not use the chat feature. When submitting your question through the Q&A feature, you can choose to submit your questions anonymously to best protect your privacy. I will be reading these questions aloud to our panelists during the question and answer portion at the end of today's session. If there are any questions that we don't get to today, we will find answers for you and send that information to you. If you have any additional questions that come up after today's session, please email international@utah.edu. We will also be posting a recording on our website in the next few days. Before we get started, I would like to mention that today's session is anonymous and any questions that you submit will not be associated with your name or your university ID in the recording on our website. So please feel free to ask any questions that you may have, and we will do our absolute best to protect your privacy. Although you were asked to provide your name and UNID during the registration process, this is for internal office use only, and this will not be shared or distributed with anyone else. All of the questions that you ask will be posted onto our website after today's session, along with that recording. All right, So we will go ahead and get started. Our first topic today is about how a journalist finds a story and develops the content. So I'm excited to welcome our first panelist, Salt Lake Tribune journalist, Taylor Stevens.
Thanks, Chelsea. It's great to be here with all of you virtually and talk about how we find and develop news stories. First of all, just to talk about, what makes something news. I think that it's a little self-explanatory when you think about it, but, what differentiates one action from another and constitutes it as newsworthy. One of the first things we think about is relevance to our audience. Each news organization has an audience. At the Salt Lake Tribune, where I work, we primarily are focused on Utah readers. Our work does have a broader reach than that, but primarily Utah. And so we're unlikely to bring you news about what the Wyoming legislature is doing or North Carolina politicians are up to. So relevance is important. Also, we think about, and this is similar, proximity. So how close something has happened to us, a plane crash in Salt Lake City versus, plane crash somewhere else is not going to get news for our audience. So that's an important consideration. Unusualness is another that we think about, and we often use the phrase, if a man bites a dog, it's news, but if a dog bites a man, it's not. So that's something that's unusual, that is novel, that would probably be more likely to get some coverage. Timeliness is another factor that we take into consideration. Generally, there is a news hook, a reason why we're talking about something right now. We're unlikely to bring a bunch of new details about the 2003 election because we're focused on the 2020 election right now. So timeliness is important. Impact, we also bring news that has to do with how it will impact our readers. So a tax increase, for example, is something that will have an impact on our audience, and so we would be likely to report on something like that. The last one would be prominence. Obviously, we don't report on every single death that happens in the state of Utah, but if a prominent figure like the governor or a former governor, a local politician were to pass away, then that's something that we would be more likely to cover. So those are some of the things that we think about when we're deciding what constitutes news and what makes something newsworthy. And from there, we go on to do a process of fact gathering, and that can take a couple of different forms. Today, I've been listening to legislative interim committee meetings all day virtually. Usually we would be up on Capitol Hill, but the news gathering will come from listening to those meetings. If I have further questions, I might call a lawmaker and get some more feedback or more information on a particular item that we have questions on. In a different circumstance, we might be building a story almost entirely off of interviews that we've done. And so if I'm writing a story about the state legislature, for example, I might talk to lawmakers who support a bill, lawmakers who are opposed to a bill, constituents that will be affected, whether positively or negatively, different community groups that have weighed in on a bill, just to kind of give a broad range of perspectives on a particular issue, with the idea that as a reader, you would be able to read all of those different perspectives and kind of come to your own conclusions about a story. But we also do a lot of work to independently verify facts. So we sometimes say trust but verify. Just because someone has told us something or has said something doesn't mean it's true. So that might look like going to documents, going to official paperwork that could verify or confirm different facts or call them into question, as well as talking to other people who might have knowledge of a situation to see how everything lines up. And if we find discrepancies, then we do our best to bring those to people in a transparent way and say, here's how we know what we know, and here's what we don't know, and what we're still trying to figure out. And that's also an important piece of the news gathering process, is we don't always know everything. We're not always able to confirm certain facts. And so we like to be transparent with our audience. So-and-so would not respond to a request for comment. They wouldn't give us their perspective. So we're going to be transparent in what we went through in that news gathering process to try and give people an insight into how we know what we know. Some other things that we do as we're going through that fact gathering process, I often go back and read past reporting on an issue so that we're able to provide additional context to our readers. If there's an issue that has come up multiple times, it's often helpful to provide that context of, what was the circumstances the last time this issue was proposed, and maybe if it did pass or didn't pass, why or why not. So we can give some context of how an issue is evolving. And then we, at the end of it all, go back to people, we go back to sources, we ask them more questions, we try to follow up and really bring the most complete information that we can to our audience. And when we don't know something, again, we try and be transparent about what we've done to try and get those answers. Just really quickly want to touch on, how we conduct interviews. And I will say that as a person who primarily is interviewing politicians and public officials, I do have a different standard for interviewing people who deal with the media and understand that their comments are on the record, versus another group that I deal with frequently is people experiencing homelessness. And so there's a different standard for making sure that people understand that you're on the record, what that means, how the information will be used. When I'm working with people in more vulnerable groups, I do a lot more work to, make sure they understand this is going to go online. This could be Google searched, are you okay with it? Do you consent? And that's an important distinction. Whereas public officials, they have a little bit more media savvy. And so they should be, not always, but they should know exactly what they're getting into when they agree to sit down with a reporter or talk to a reporter. And I am incredibly unlikely to take comments off the record at that point. Whereas, somebody experiencing homelessness who's told me some very personal details of their life, I may be a little bit more willing to make an exception in some of those cases. So there is a distinction there, and we take that into consideration, your level of understanding of the media and that process. I usually record my interviews, which is just a best practice to ensure that quotes are accurate. It's really a good thing for everyone, because if a politician says I misquoted them, or anyone says I misquoted them, I'm able to go back and double check and say, actually, no, you did say that, and here's the recording. So that's kind of a best practice that we do. We try to avoid off the record sources as much as possible. And there are some circumstances where we do allow that, but only when the information can't be acquired from anywhere else. And oftentimes there is a way to get information or to convince people the public interest of a story. So at the Tribune, we very rarely use off the record sources, unnamed sources. However, that has become very commonplace at the national level. And I would say is, a difficult situation, because if reporters are quoting off the record sources and getting a story, kind of leads to a situation where other reporters are chasing that story and feel they also have to use off the record sources. But at the local level and at the Salt Lake Tribune, it's something that we typically avoid. The last thing I'll just run quickly through is some questions about ethics and what ethical guidelines we hold ourselves to. Most journalists do hold ourselves to the Society of Professional Journalists Ethics Guide, and there are many, very wide-ranging set of guidelines that we follow, including that we verify information before we release it, that we prioritize accuracy over speed, that we seek out subjects of news coverage who are being criticized to make sure they have a chance to respond to any allegations of wrongdoing, that we always attribute the information and tell people how we know what we know, that we avoid conflicts of interest, that if there is a circumstance in which you have a personal stake in a story, that you maybe step back from that story, and that you're open with your editors about what that conflict of interest is. And also that we acknowledge mistakes and we correct them prominently and promptly. So you may see on a story that we have indicated we got it wrong, we messed something up, we had an incorrect fact in a story, and we're going to prominently display a correction to let people know that we've made some changes. And And that, again, is in the interest of full transparency, which is one of our major guiding principles. So that's just kind of a quick run through of how we do our jobs. And I think with that, I'll turn it over to Randy, and I'll be happy to take questions at the end.
Great. Thank you, Taylor. So our next topic is about identifying fake news and how to generally assess reliable news information. So I am pleased to welcome our next panelist, Professor Randy Dreyer.
Thank you, Chelsea. Good afternoon to everyone. I'm going to spend maybe the next 10 minutes or so talking about news misinformation, and specifically misinformation on social media. So I've got a few slides here that I will share, and then we'll get started. Okay, can everyone see my slides? They just went blank on my screen.
Yeah, they look like they went blank, Randy, just for a second there.
Huh.
There they are.
You got them now?
Yeah, we can see them. Or at least
Okay,
I can over here.
Yeah, I still can't see them, so hopefully everyone else can.
We can hear you. That's what matters, right?
Well, yeah, hopefully. Oh, let me try this again here. Let's. Technology is great when it works.
I'm just happy we can see you. I feel like I haven't seen you in years.
Yeah. Huh. We even tested this out beforehand and it worked fine, didn't it? Okay, well, it doesn't look like it's opening. Well, all right, so.
It is opening now. We can see that PowerPoint is starting up.
Oh, you can?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Is it advancing? Well, why don't I just continue? I'll try to fuss with this and see if we can get it to display. But so I'm talking about misinformation, and misinformation isn't new. It's been around for centuries. But what is new is how information is rapidly spread in today's sort of digital age. And this is primarily due to three factors. First is the explosive growth of social media. Globally, there are over 4 billion people in the world that use social media. And of course, Facebook is kind of the 800-pound gorilla in the social media network world. 70% of US adults use Facebook. That percentage increases up to 88% of those who are aged between 18 and 29. And of course, there are dozens and dozens of other social networks: Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, Snapchat, and others. So it's a huge explosive growth of social media. It's growing at a rate about 12% new users every year. That means about every second, 14 new social media networks are being opened. And of course, the hallmark of a social media network is instantaneous sharing that you can do by simply a click of the mouse. So that's the first factor that has resulted in this spread of news misinformation, is the explosive growth of social media. The second factor is that along with this explosive growth has been a concomitant decline in what are called traditional news gatekeepers. These are newspapers and broadcast outlets. Of course, those traditional news gatekeepers, they have editors and fact checkers. So Taylor has an editor who is making sure that what Taylor writes is accurate and has the proper context. Of course, those traditional gatekeepers, those fact checkers and editors, are absent from social media networks. And then the third factor that has contributed to this increased spread of misinformation is that at least until lately, social media networks have basically taken a hands-off policy in terms of regulating content on their networks. All right, are you seeing any slides at all? Nope. Okay. Well, misinformation on social media comes in a whole variety of forms, and I'm just going to identify 4 of them very quickly. There's fake news, and of course, fake news has that definition of what that means has changed over time. It is not like some politicians use the word. It's just not news that they disagree with. I'm going to use fake news in the classic context of a purported news site that appears to be legitimate on its face, but in reality is not. It is intentionally fabricated and is designed to look like a legitimate news site. If you go on Wikipedia, they have identified more than 40 sites that are true fake news sites. They're not legitimate sites. Another source of misinformation, another form of misinformation, is manipulated video and audio, what's referred to as deep fakes. And that's where it's sort of like Photoshop on steroids. It's where artificial intelligence is used to alter the video or the audio so it appears as if someone is speaking when in fact they are not actually speaking the words or engaging in the actions that they appear to be doing. Another form of misinformation, of course, are conspiracy theories. We've seen those, they're just rampant right now with the coronavirus, and hoaxes. The COVID-19 was a bio weapon created by China. You can cure the coronavirus through drinking bleach. Masks don't help. Dozens and dozens of conspiracy theories and hoaxes surrounding the coronavirus. Others are 5G causes cancer. And then, of course, there's the QAnon, which is a conspiracy theory that there's a criminal conspiracy that's hatched by a collective of sort of deep state, satanic child molesters that sole mission in life is to defeat Donald Trump. So hoaxes and conspiracy theories are a significant form of misinformation. And then the final category I'd like to just briefly mention are political ads. So particularly for an international student, I would recommend that any political ad be taken with a serious dose of skepticism. Political ads have become great purveyors of, if not totally false information, definitely misleading information. They've become so bad that Twitter, for example, has banned all political ads. Facebook has been faced with increasing criticism because they are unwilling to remove content by politicians, and that includes political ads that politicians pay for. They just recently announced that they will no longer allow any new political ads beginning 1 week before the November 3rd elections. But all the old ads and ads that have been created and posted previously will still remain on their site. It's important to know that most social media networks do not fact check political ads at all. Okay, so who spreads social information or misinformation on social media? Well, there are 5 primary, what I would call super spreaders. Foreign governments, they have a foreign policy objective in mind. That's why they spread misinformation. It's really no longer seriously contested that Russia was heavily involved in spreading misinformation during the last presidential election, and it appears that they're doing the same in the 2020 elections as well. In fact, it was just reported about 3 or 4 days ago that the FBI has opened up an investigation surrounding the emergence of a laptop supposedly owned by presidential candidate Joe Biden's son that implicates his father in improper foreign policy conduct. But perhaps a greater threat than foreign governments in terms of spreading misinformation are domestic partisan political actors. Parties of the major political parties, the candidates themselves, special interest groups, you're pro-life, you're anti-abortion, you're a climate change activist, whatever it might be. If you have a special interest, chances are they're going to be spreading misinformation for their particular purposes and perhaps just to raise more money to support their cause. Then there's another group that spreads misinformation on social media, what I call commercial outlets that specialize in clickbait. They don't have a political agenda, they have an economic incentive. A lot of advertising on the web is driven by how many page views and clicks you get. And so a sensational headline or link that evokes in a strong emotional response to you, tempts you to click on it, that increases the page views to that particular website. They in turn then can charge more money for advertisements. Of course, the social media networks themselves are spreaders of misinformation because their entire financial model is based on user engagement. So the more site visits they have, the more engagement, the more likes, retweets, etc., the more data they're going to collect on the user, which then translates into information they can sell to marketers and targeted advertisers. And then finally, the last sort of super spreader are all of us ourselves who are social media users. Too many social media users are sort of obsessed with how many likes they get of their post, or how many retweets of their tweet, or how many followers they have. All right, so what are some practical things that you could do to avoid spreading misinformation on social media? Well, I've got 4 practical suggestions for you. The first is just simply think before you share anything. Consider the source, check the author. Most news sites, most news articles will have, if they're legitimate, will have an author. If there's no author, that's a big giant red flag for you, as it might be something that's totally contrived. But even if there is an author, not all authors are actual real persons. So you should do a quick little research to check out the author, make sure they're a real person, make sure that they're credible, see what other stories they've written. Do they have a bias? are they employed by some organization that has a particular point of view? Avoid clickbait headlines. Check the publish date. Be wary of sort of shocking type quotes and photos. A common ploy of those who disseminate false information is to use a graphic photograph, but it's an old photograph in a totally different context. And so you can do what's called a reverse image search using either Google or TinEye to identify where else has that image been used on the web and in what context. Be cognizant of your biases. One naturally gives greater credence to information that confirms your own beliefs and discounts information that does not. So be aware of that. And then you should probably, if it's a serious piece of information that you're going to make some decision on based on whether it's accurate or not, you might want to visit a fact-checking site. And my next slide would have 4 fact-checking sites that I would recommend. I understand these slides will be posted afterwards, so I would encourage you to do that. And then finally, just be skeptical. If a strong emotional response is evoked from something you read, just think twice before you share it. I apologize for you not being able to see the slides, but as I said, I think they'll be posted with the recording of this webinar. All right, I think now to Professor Holton.
Thank you, Professor Dreyer. And like you said, we certainly will be posting these slides on our website after today's session, and we apologize for those technical difficulties. Our third topic today is about how journalism has changed with the advent of various platforms such as YouTube and Twitter, and how the audience's perception or consumption of the news has also changed. So I am pleased to welcome our next panelist, Professor Holton.
Everyone hear me okay? Just want to make sure. I'm getting one bar and I've had a couple technical difficulties hopping on. All right, checking one more time. Can anyone hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Okay, great. I'll stop right here then. I'm sort of walking to get a signal. Thank you. And if I do cut out, please, move forward and I'll sprint and grab my laptop and hook that up and join the conversation again. I'm really glad to be here, and I'm glad that I caught the last 2 discussions, because I think they feed into my portion really well. And I'm just going to talk for 5 or 6 minutes so we can have a bigger Q&A here at the end. But I was asked to talk a little bit about how social media have changed the way that journalists do their jobs. And it's not only timely for me because I research this area, but it's timely because I had a conversation last week with an international body of scholars, 8 to 10 of us who are working on this issue right now. And Professor Dreyer might be interested in hearing this, because we talked a little bit about the need for some of this in the class that we taught together on misinformation. But really what we're looking at is the way journalists feel like their identities have changed because of social media. And to give you an example of this, I'm sure Taylor and others could speak to this as well. 10 years ago, most journalists were not using social media, at least not on a daily basis. We're not using web analytics, and we're not expected to converse with audiences all that much or to convey any elements of their personal life. And social media has changed that dramatically, right? So now we have journalists who've gone from using either 0, maybe 1 platform like Facebook 10 years ago, a decade or so ago, to most journalists now reporting using 6 to 8 social media platforms every single day. That's a dramatic shift for somebody whose job is to research and report and hunt down sources and facts and information. And you add something like that on top, and then you also add in web analytics, and the power of numbers. So this idea that being able to predict what should be news or what will get eyeballs or those clicks that Professor Dreyer mentioned, instead of relying on a journalist's gut instinct, journalists now have to do that as well. So the journalists that we are talking to now, and we're planning on talking to about 1,000 international journalists, the pilot portion of the study has shown us that the majority of journalists feel like they're sharing more and more of their personal lives on social media, and they're expected to look more like people and less like bots in these spaces, if that makes sense. And the way that journalists do that, the way they separate themselves from looking like bots, is to offer things like opinion, to offer things like emotion, to offer things like humor. And we see those increasingly, and that can be a good way to connect with audiences. But gosh, it can really draw into concern, or at least into question, journalistic ethics. And what was mentioned earlier by Taylor, I think the SPJ code of ethics, right? Which some would argue has been fluid, or at least has been a little more reflexive in the past few years, because a journalist is now expected to a degree to have some bias, and is expected to be transparent about that bias. So in other words, if somebody is covering the story of Hunter Biden's purported laptop and the information there within, if they know Hunter Biden or knew him professionally, or if they work for Apple, if that's what his laptop was, or if they work for an analytics company, that they say that, or that if they have in the past, that they disclose that early on and be transparent, not only about that, but also about their sources, about the way in which they've collected their evidence and data. And we did not see that in the New York Post story, right? There was some information relayed about how or who this laptop and the information on it came from, a computer repairman, which, gosh, a lot of red flags there. But the journalists themselves are expected to be more transparent, are expected to offer more elements that we would call humanistic. So humor, opinion, bias, and those sorts of things. And yes, that can get them in trouble. And we did see that at the very start of Twitter, with folks in a couple of cases getting fired for offering their political opinions or their religious beliefs on journalistic platforms. But now a lot of newsrooms have relaxed that. And in fact, a really great example is CNN. If you've watched CNN for more than, let's say, 2 or 3 years, you've noticed a dramatic shift in coverage, especially late night coverage offered by CNN, which used to be just a 24-hour news broadcasting platform. And now, if you hop on at night, you've got Chris Cuomo, Don Lemon, and Anderson Cooper. And these guys offer their opinion, and they offer their take, and they offer humor and sarcasm, and they connect with one another for better or for worse. And I would argue that one of the biggest things that does in terms of divisiveness is create sort of a party line, right? It's very clear to look at CNN now and to think that they're either moderate or liberal, and it's very clear to look at something like Fox and consider them as Republican and conservative, right? So we see those party lines because of the bias that's introduced and acknowledged in those settings. And I also would say, from some of the internal documents leaked from CNN, that the reporters are encouraged to do that, if not paid more to do that, right? To increase those ratings, to increase those clicks, to increase those eyeballs by offering that sort of bias. And so just to finish off before we move forward, it's something that we have to consider, that journalists now, for better or for worse, are being charged with being more humanistic on social media platforms and in their reporting, to connect with audiences, to pay attention to numbers, to really make sure that they're separating themselves from the bots that are out there that Professor Dreyer mentioned. And in a lot of cases, this winds up calling the reporting into question along political and party lines. And that's a really big concern right now. And it's something we see so presently with the current political climate, especially in the US. And I'll leave it with that, and then hopefully we can prod around there some more in the Q&A.
Thank you, Professor Holton. Our final topic before we move on to the question and answer portion of today's session is about how to research these issues and what resources are available to you so you can actually find factual information. So I am very pleased to welcome Associate Librarian of the Marriott Library, Darby Fanning.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. Hey everyone, I'm going to share my screen and start and go as quickly as I can through a lot of stuff. And so I'm going to share my PowerPoint with you guys, and I hope you can see it just fine. All right. And what I'd like to start with before I get into the actual slides is that before I start to sell you the what of this, like what is it that you're going to be using? Why, I'm going to sell you the whys, why you want to use different resources as different tools for different purposes. And so in order, and I'm going to try to stay away from jargon, in order to understand US media and consumerism, we really have to consider which situation is at hand before us, whether it's the political game, whether it's the presidential elections, whether it's Space Force, whether it's whatever it is. We have to look at it and determine which rhetorical appeals, meaning how is it that the speaker is trying to convince you of something, because there is always some kind of argument, whether it is direct or indirect. And how they are used in different publications in order to influence and produce a desired outcome. And also, since we all read through our own filters, which come in, those are in numerous and varied ways, the ability to understand cultural subtext within the communication of information is most often difficult because of the subtleties, and are also most often very indirect or unknown. So basically, we don't know what it is and what we don't know. So first, what we're going to do is look at some basics as to why the news isn't held in the highest regards, as well as then quickly examine the tenets of evaluation of information and types of publications one would most likely encounter for information. And finally, your best resources for information discovery and learning through your librarians and library resources. So just to give some background, and this has been discussed a little bit, is that, and I didn't learn this until a couple of years ago, is that the news is not required to tell the truth at all. It's not necessarily fake news, but there's no laws, no regulations or anything that has been enforced by the FCC. It wasn't until 1969 that the news distortion policy, but it's never been adopted. And what we're looking, and what it was developed to do, is prevent falsehoods or intentional, direct or indirect bias that can and does influence capital and political gains. So news is actually considered entertainment. So we have to learn how to read through it. So how can we trust what we read and what we hear? Where can we find reputable information and research? That's a good question. Is that really what we should look at first is what the rhetorical appeals are, what is used to try to convince you as you're reading. So how we perceive things is how we receive it and how we respond internally and externally. So as students, we want to critically read, critically listen, for critical thinking in that. And through media, information, and research, what the speaker is seeking is to get you to trust them through logic, using specific reason, and providing proof, hopefully, appealing to your values and your emotion, and using exact timing. So that way it's ripe for the picking. And this can be extremely manipulative too. So it all depends. And as you know, like Fox News is different than the Washington Post, for example, that we see that there is a different bent. And we want to pay attention to that so that way we can see exactly what is trying to be sold to us in that. So moving from that is how do we evaluate information? And really what we're looking for in this is not only currency, and that's not money, but relevance, the purpose of the publication itself, and also what your purpose is for doing the research, or does something fulfill your needs? But honestly, we're looking directly at authority and accuracy. So and we can match this up to the 5 W's and H. So how can we determine the authority of a publication and also an author, if the author does exist? And like Dr. Dreyer was saying earlier, be suspect if there is not an author. So moving forward, because I'm trying to go quickly, is that when we're looking at, there are different types of publications. And so publication types, specifically when it comes to print and the largest ones, these are the pieces involved in those that are most popular and how they inspire trust and credibility or not. So the popular press is for the general public at large. The publication cycle is daily, weekly, or monthly, so it comes out. The publication cycle is very fast and very quick. Typically with the reading level at the lowest is 5th to 6th grade, and the highest is typically 9th to 10th grade. 10th grade is New York Times. That's where they stand. And when you're reading in the popular press, sources are often not fully cited, or there is a difficulty of findability or location. That's very different than academic or scholarly resources. These are created for students, for experts, academicians, and scientists. For example, they don't have, and did I spell publication wrong? I did, sorry. They typically have non-standard publication cycles. Monthly, quarterly, biannually, annually, or irregular. The reading level lends to higher education, and they're specifically specialized to subject or discipline with that specific language and jargon. The sources are always cited, and they always provide for author credentials as well. So as we move into like what it is that you would use, honestly, whatever your purpose is determines on what you use. I'm not here to tell you that Google is the devil, because it's not. It all, everything serves its purpose. But as we move through the research process, which I have right here, it's very time intensive actually, even though it looks very easy, is that there are some places, and like very, very quickly in 2 minutes, I just want to show you one of the databases. If you don't know about it, I'm not going to do much in it at all. I just want to show you where it is in the Marriott Library. I'm going to stop sharing that for a second and then bring up, here we go, Marriott, and share again. Okay, so with the Marriott Library, you always have to log in, and with databases, click on databases, and I should be logged in already. And I'm going to go to a database to start with. This is one that I tell my students to use. And I also start with, after Google Scholar, is Academic Search Ultimate. This is a space where you can choose to do your search, and then also you can choose specifically scholarly or peer-reviewed journals to indicate what it is that you want the expert, that you want the specialist specifically speaking to you. Now that might be too high level, or it might be unnecessary for what your purpose is, but I wanted to show you that. And really what it comes down to is the best thing you can do is talk to a librarian and sit down with your research question. So that, because research is a conversation, and we can have that conversation and work things out, and I can teach you much, much, much more about how to do this to the best of your abilities. So that's what I have.
Thank you so much, Darby. All right, we'll go ahead and move on to the question and answer portion now. And I know we're running down on time, but I do want to make sure we get to some of these questions. So we might just go a few minutes over the normal time, although I do want to be mindful of everyone's time. The first question that has come up is about free speech and online platforms. It says, I have heard that many social media platforms are currently monitoring political content right now and even removing some of that content. Do you have any thoughts on how social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter determine fake news or inaccurate information? When would they decide to remove that information or label it as inaccurate? And then how does this tie into the First Amendment? Who would like to start with their thoughts?
I could take a crack at that. Yeah, it's just within the last literally weeks that the social media platforms have begun labeling information on their platforms as misleading or false or inaccurate, or in some extreme cases, removing the content. It's important to know that in the United States, we do have a free press, and it's protected by the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, but it is a limiter only on what government can do. So the government would not be able to, if there was a government site, to block substantive content because of the First Amendment. But the First Amendment protections doesn't apply to private companies. So there's no legal obligation for the private companies, Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, to remove content. But they've chosen to do so in some limited circumstances because of the public pressure. And basically, they're worried about government trying to regulate them and worried about the government repealing a federal law that grants immunity to web hosts and website owners from any liability for false information that is posted by someone else. The way they've been doing it is they've hired literally an army of fact checkers, but the problem is that the information is spread so quickly that it's very difficult to have those fact checkers review something and then have it removed or flagged.
Does anyone else on the panel have any other thoughts about that? Or we can move on to the next question. All right. The next question is, there's so much media and information, particularly with a 24/7 news cycle. What are your suggestions for staying informed, but also not getting overwhelmed? Anybody want to kick off that discussion?
I could take a stab. This is Avery. It's a great question, right? So I gave a presentation a couple weeks ago where we looked at just basic, the amount of media that a normal person interacts with in a day. And we're now looking at, and I think Professor Dreyer's heard this number too before in our teachings, we are now using our phones 8 to 10 hours a day, 8 to 10 hours a day. Like I think I'm only awake like 14 hours a day. I'm still stuck in my kind of high school years, but we're using our phones that much. And about 75% of that is social media, news media, information access. It's not so much the games, Boggle, Word Connect, whatever it is anymore. And what's really cool is we've sort of evolved as we've gone along. So first it was having access to phones and devices. Now we've reached a near saturation with that. Although we shouldn't forget that some people don't have access, right? Or don't have 24/7 access to the internet and have to go to libraries or bus stops and those things. But for those who do, which is roughly 92% of the US, it's a constant inundation, and we can fall into filter bubbles where we choose, which apps to use, which people to follow. And we see that a lot on social media, right? If we look at our followers or the people that engage with our content, they tend to be the same people over and over and over again. Friends, family, people with similar views, those sorts of things. But where we can break out of that and where we actually do, according to some of the research, is in choosing outlets that we follow for news and information. And some of the things that we can do are choose outlets that aggregate that news for us. So Apple News does that. BuzzFeed News does that to a degree. Bleacher Report, if you're into sports, all sorts of apps out there to help us winnow down the content and actually show us what we're interested in. Now, the harm in that, or the potential harm in that, is those all come with algorithms that have the biases of coders written into them. And in some cases have biases of the publications written into them, right? And we do an exercise in one of my classes where students will use BuzzFeed News, the BuzzFeed News app and the Apple News app to see what pops up every day. And in some cases, there's some pretty drastic differences, not only in the stories that are presented, in the ways that they're covered as well. So one of the things that you can do is limit the white noise. And that means removing apps and things that you just don't use, or that aren't beneficial, or that are just causing you more stress than harm. And we see that a lot with Facebook right now, people taking snooze breaks on Facebook until the election is over. And then also finding those apps or finding those platforms that do give you information and do give you different perspectives, and really following those and kind of creating your own diet. And as an example, one of the other exercises we do is have students find the 15 minutes a day, whether it's breakfast, lunch, dinner, some other time, where they can actually give themselves the freedom to roam around and hunt and peck at different news articles and platforms and apps, right? So find that sort of diet that fits for you and cut out the white noise.
This is Randy. I would echo what Professor Holton said, and my advice would be to have 3 or 4 credible news sites that you have confidence in. Make sure that they are all not from the same political perspective. Otherwise, you're just going to get the echo chamber and hear everything. So deliberately look at one that is perhaps has a different perspective than your own personal beliefs. That way, you'll get at least some exposure to additional viewpoints. But you really can't look at maybe 3 or 4 max without just being flooded with too much information.
All right, thank you for your perspective. We are right now at time, but I do, just because we were running a little bit late, want to ask one more question, and if anybody has any quick thoughts on that, can wrap up today's session. The last question is, the VP debate was recently held at the University of Utah. In your perspective, do these debates actually change people's minds? Do they have any effect on the actual election?
No.
That, Chelsea. Well, yeah, exactly. We had some polling in Utah that showed that most voters are, already know who they're going to vote for and are firm in that decision. And so at least locally, and we can extrapolate that nationally as well, that most people are decided in the election, and those kind of events don't often change people's minds. There are allegedly some undecided voters. I'd love to talk to them, but it's possible, but for the big chunk of people who are tuning in, they already know who they're going to vote for at this stage in the election cycle.
Political debates, you watch them for their entertainment value, not to inform you.
All right. Since I would like to sincerely thank all of our panelists for joining us here today, and then for all of you who are watching either live or recordings later on. And so thank you all for your participation today. And we will be posting, as I had said, we'll be posting this session recording on our website, as well as the additional resources and slides that were shared today. As we're ending today, I will go ahead and put up a final slide. It does have a QR code on it, and it will take you directly to our website. So again, thank you for joining us today, and we hope that you will join us for our next session next week, which will be our final session in this political webinar series, and it is focused on student advocacy. So thank you all for your time today, and I hope that you have a great evening. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.